Before the darkness, there was a strange, deceptive quiet. The late 1930 seconds in London were a time of nervous smiles and held breaths. War was a shadow on the horizon, a name whispered in pubs and debated in Parliament. The government, remembering the Zeppelin raids of the Great War, began to prepare. They issued 38 million gas masks in cardboard boxes. They dug trenches in public parks. They called it air raid precautions. But there was one place, a vast, ready-made subterranean fortress that they refused to consider: the London Underground. Their reasoning seemed logical, at least on paper. The stations were vital arteries for a nation preparing for war. Commuter and troop travel could not be impeded. There were sanitation concerns, the fear that disease would sweep through thousands of people crammed together. But beneath it all was a deeper, more profound fear, a fear of the people themselves. The government worried that if Londoners went underground, they might refuse to come out, that a deep shelter mentality would set in, shattering the nation's morale and its will to fight. So the official policy was set in stone. In the event of an air raid, the tube would not be a shelter. The first year of the war was the phony war. The sirens wailed, but the bombs didn't fall. Life went on. But then came the summer of 1940. France fell. The British Army was miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk. The island nation stood alone, and across the Channel, the Luftwaffe gathered its strength. The quiet was about to break. The sound came first, on the afternoon of September 7th, 1940. It was a sound London had never heard before. Not a simple drone, but a vast, sky-filling roar. Hundreds of German bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, blotting out the sun. For hours, they pounded the city's sprawling docklands. The port, the industrial heart of the British Empire, became an inferno. That night, the bombers returned, guided by the very fires they had started. This was not war on a distant battlefield. This was total war, brought to the doorstep, the kitchen, the bedroom. As the city burned, a desperate primal search for safety began. But where could you hide from a threat that fell from the sky? The official public shelters were often little more than brick and concrete structures on the surface, offering scant protection from a direct hit. Cellars shook, and Anderson shelters in back gardens felt terrifyingly flimsy. The answer, everyone knew, lay deep beneath their feet. In the first days of the Blitz, as bombs rained down, the government held to its policy. Police constables stood guard at the entrances to the underground, barring the public from the city's deepest and safest shelters. The gates were locked, but the will of a people forged in fire proved stronger than any government order. This wasn't a riot. It was a quiet, desperate, and overwhelmingly powerful act of civil disobedience. Families began to arrive at the stations, not to travel, but to stay. They bought the cheapest tickets available, descended to the platforms, and simply refused to leave. Eyewitness accounts from those first nights describe a tide of humanity that authorities were powerless to stop. At some stations, the crowd simply pushed past the guards. At others, the locked gates were forced open. The government, facing a choice between chaos on the streets or chaos on the platforms, had no choice. They relented. The city below the city was officially, if reluctantly, opened. A new, strange, and quintessentially London ritual began. Every day, as the afternoon light began to fade, the trekkers would appear. Orderly queues would form, a river of humanity flowing towards the station entrances. People of all classes, from East End dockers to West End secretaries, clutching their bedding, thermoses of tea, and most precious belongings. They would wait patiently until 4 p.m. Then the gates would open, and they would descend. Down, down, down the escalators, away from the terrifying howl of the sirens and the crump of falling bombs, to claim a few square feet of cold, hard concrete that would be their home for the night. This was the Great Migration. To understand what life was like down there, you have to imagine the senses. First, the smell. The unique tube smell, a mixture of damp concrete, ozone from the train lines, and strong disinfectant, was now layered with the smells of humanity: unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, spilled tea, and the unmistakable acrid scent of fear. Then, the sound. The nightly bombing raid, the defining soundtrack of life above, was transformed down here. The sharp, terrifying explosions became dull, distant thuds that vibrated through the earth. The more immediate sounds were human: the constant coughing that echoed in the damp air, the snoring of 100 strangers, the whimpering of a frightened child, quickly shushed by a mother, the low murmur of conversation, and later, the defiant sound of sing-alongs, voices rising in unison to drown out the fear. And the sight: a sea of bodies lining the platforms, packed so tightly there was no room to walk. Families would chalk out their pitches on the concrete, a tiny territorial claim. Posters on the tiled walls, advertising holiday destinations and West End shows, seemed like relics from another universe. The flickering, dim lights cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar stations into something cavernous and strange. At its peak in September 1940, 177,000 souls a night made this subterranean journey. An entire city, breathing, sleeping, and dreaming, packed along 79 miles of track, deep underground. This was a life of routine and improvisation. The last train would rattle through around 10:30 p.m., its passage a thunderous interruption. After that, the electricity to the rails was switched off, and people would spill from the crowded platforms onto the tracks themselves, laying down their blankets on the wooden sleepers. But this strange sanctuary was not without its own ghosts. The war, relentless and cruel, could still find you. On October 14th, 1940, a bomb pierced through the road above Balham Station. It detonated in the northern end tunnel, rupturing water mains and sewers. A torrent of water, mud and debris cascaded onto the platform below, burying the sheltering civilians. 66 people died, drowning in darkness, deep beneath the ground they had sought for safety. Weeks later, a direct hit on the ticket hall of Bank Station caused the escalator tunnel to collapse, killing over 100. The platforms offered refuge, but they were not invincible. The dull thuds from above were a constant reminder that the barrier between their world and the war was only a few dozen feet of London clay. And sometimes the greatest danger wasn't from the enemy above, but from the raw, unthinking panic within. The night of March 3rd, 1943, was dark and wet. The residents of the East End were making their way to the shelter at Bethnal Green, which was not yet a functioning tube station but a massive, newly constructed underground space. The entrance was a single, steep flight of 19 steps, poorly lit and open to the elements. Just after 8:15 p.m., a sound was heard. It wasn't a bomb. It was the unfamiliar, deafening roar of a new anti-aircraft rocket battery being fired for the first time from a nearby park. In the darkness and confusion, the crowd panicked, assuming the worst. They surged forward, desperate to get below ground. Near the bottom of the stairs, a woman carrying a baby and a bundle tripped and fell. An elderly man fell over her. In an instant, the narrow staircase became a fatal bottleneck. The immense pressure from the hundreds of people behind them, unaware of the blockage, created a human avalanche. Within seconds, nearly 300 people were jammed into the tiny stairwell, a solid mass of bodies. There was no bomb, no fire, no explosion. There was only the crushing weight of terrified humanity. When it was over, 173 men, women, and children were dead, crushed and asphyxiated in a desperate stampede for a safety that was only feet away. It was the single largest loss of civilian life in a single incident during the entire Second World War in Britain, a tragedy born not of enemy action, but of fear itself. But out of this darkness, this chaos, something remarkable, something truly resilient, began to grow. The British spirit of muddling through transformed into a genius for organisation. These were not just shelters, they became vibrant, self-governing communities. Informal shelter committees quickly formed, led by elected shelter marshals. They tackled the immediate problems, establishing basic rules for sanitation, noise control, and settling disputes over precious sleeping space. These were miniature democracies, born of necessity, deep underground. Organizations like the British Red Cross and the Salvation Army arrived, working to improve conditions. And eventually, the government, realizing this was the new reality, began to help. Bunks were built in 3 tiers, maximizing space. Chemical toilets were installed. Canteen trains, nicknamed refreshment specials, would roll into the stations, providing hot soup, sandwiches, and life-giving tea. Tickets were issued for sleeping spots to reduce the hours spent queuing in the cold. And humanity, in its stubborn refusal to despair, endured. A shelter newsletter, the Tube Station Tidings, was printed and distributed at the Elephant and Castle station. Local libraries established lending services on the platforms. Impromptu concerts echoed through the tiled tunnels, with famous entertainers like Flanagan and Allen making surprise appearances to boost morale. Life, against all odds, went on. What's most extraordinary, however, is what didn't happen. Pre-war psychoanalysts and government officials had predicted a psychological collapse. Widespread shell shock, mass hysteria, a breakdown of social order. They were profoundly wrong. The psychoanalyst Anna Freud, working in London at the time, observed that children often seemed more traumatized by the evacuation and separation from their parents than by the bombing itself. An American witness, the journalist Vincent Sheehan, wrote in awe, "By every test and measure I am able to apply, these people are staunch to the bone and won't quit. The British are stronger and in a better position than they were at its beginning." Londoners did not break. In fact, official statistics showed that the number of suicides and cases of drunkenness actually declined during the Blitz. People developed a kind of grim, fatalistic humour, referring to the nightly raids as if they were the weather, calmly stating that a day was very blitzy. And here lies a surprising, often overlooked truth. A November 1940 census revealed that only about 4% of Londoners actually slept in the tube on any given night. Another 9% used public surface shelters. A significant 27% had their own private Anderson or Morrison shelters. That means the vast majority, nearly 60% of the city, simply stayed at home. They listened to the bombs fall from their own beds, trusting in fate and the law of averages. They absorbed the stress, the fear, and the loss. And they got up the next morning, swept up the broken glass, and went to work. The Blitz was a weapon of terror. It was designed with a single strategic goal: to shatter the morale of a nation, to bomb a civilian population into submission. It was a profound miscalculation. It failed because it fundamentally misunderstood the quiet, stubborn, and often infuriatingly resilient courage of ordinary people. The story of the London Underground during the war is now the stuff of legend. But it's not just a story about finding shelter from bombs. It's the story of how, in the darkest of times, people create light. How communities are forged in shared adversity. It's the story of the morning after, of climbing the stairs back into the daylight, not knowing if your home would still be standing, and yet, climbing them anyway. It's the story of how a city under siege refused to be broken, finding the strength to endure, not in fortified bunkers or government decrees, but in the simple, human act of being together, and in the shared, unspoken promise to see the sunrise. Deep beneath the streets, and high above in the rubble-strewn avenues, London held the line.